Fire Emblem Heroes game design. Introduce the problem and then sell the solution. It's not particularly new, and it's the reason why we get so many new units and skills that shift the landscape of the game either temporarily or permanently. It's hard not to have this happen in these types of games, and striking a balance can be really difficult, especially if it boils down to just keeping the game interesting, or at least engaging enough to where people don't really get bored with it. Although some additions at times are direct responses to specific units or effects that are super dominant, and with the recent addition of firm Canto Curb, it spurred me to talk about this finally because it seemed like an interesting discussion point. Because if you really think about it, what exactly is notable about firm Canto Curb? Yeah, it negates all of the end turn effects, which is really great. However, that's all it really provides, which for some may be perfectly fine because of units like Dual Leon or New Year Sather just being as dumb as they are. But what happens once they're effectively banished because of the mere existence of the skill? A skill existing by itself could act as a deterrent to people who would have otherwise considered using a unit because it has a chance of just not working whatsoever. Similar to the likes of Ruse 4, although by that point Katria was already being shifted away or just wasn't as common as she once was. And firm Canto Curb is most likely going to act in the same vein, at least for Summoner Duels purposes, since the skill is most likely not going to affect Sather for Aether Raid's purposes, at least on offense. You know, rest in peace Sather defense teams. But if or once that does happen, what does firm Canto Curb really have over its tier 3 variant beyond arena scoring? For what it's worth, the skill itself is already very useful even at its tier 3 version. Stopping Canto effects is generally really strong in basically every single mode, so it's hard to argue whether it could have been more broadly useful than it already is, although preferably if a skill is going to get some kind of upgrade or new tier variant, you'd probably want it to include something that makes it more broadly useful or significant in some way that allows it to be competitive in that slot. Although history has shown that some upgrades don't make the biggest splash or don't really mean anything at the end of the day, such as solo, and if it's not in need of an upgrade for that time, then it could be best just to leave it as is. Although I can't really imagine what a tier 4 Canto control could have looked like if the end turn stuff wasn't implemented or around whatsoever, and I can't say Leon didn't have it coming because he was arguably one of the worst designed units ever, only really behind the likes of stuff like Elamine, and we've had plenty of history with this game effectively releasing overcorrections to fix these types of units and effects. But then that brings on the discussion of how effects or counters of these kinds could have really been implemented that's not only reasonable, but also doesn't completely screw over the entire game. Maybe some effects and counters just shouldn't have been implemented at all if what comes out of it isn't going to be healthy in the slightest, like false start and end turn effects. Anything that directly prevents players from interacting with the game itself doesn't seem fathomably good game design, but I'm not a game designer, so maybe that doesn't mean much at the end of the day. Although with Leon being officially done, I would say the closest thing we have to an omnipresent threat now would probably be Emblem Ike, and part of that might be a consequence of hard countering skills that were deemed overtuned. Of course, even on debut, Ike was very strong, but I think it's fair to say that he only got significantly stronger over the course of several releases, including the likes of Breath of Life and Emblem Celica. Although the latter is more of a different approach to his preconceived playstyle of just enemy phasing, it just opens up more room for him to do other stuff. And I've definitely had my criticisms when it came to modern taking and Fae, and over the course of this year, they've added several means of alleviating the issue with all sorts of skills and units including Breath of Life, but I would argue it's one of the most overtuned skills we got in this year, on the basis that it actively removes avenues people can go down to keep tanks from going out of control, you know, with the likes of flare damage. I very much would argue flare damage was a perfectly fine effect that opened up opportunities for units to perform in combat, and while some units definitely took it to its extreme, I would still stand by the idea that for most of its iterations, and to some extent units like Legendary Camilla, were perfectly fine as is. Breath of Life, while actively benefiting tanks, also went to the extreme of completely negating flare damage and providing active healing per combat, making the prospect of tanking so much more favorable to the point where any infantry can run the copy-paste Lagu's Friend Breath of Life set and most likely be well off in a lot of scenarios, barring Summoner Duels, but that's very much its own thing, and it's only at this point because of the overabundance of skills and and units that just outright made pierceable DR unreliable. Although by the standards of Fae and IS, they tend to do something like this if they just kind of want to overcorrect pretty much any effect or make it so it's easier to counter, so much to the point where it may end up killing it entirely. And I think you can have a bunch of effects become widespread while also keeping it somewhat healthy, such as null follow-up. And even though that skill very much falls in line with the idea of removing something from the game, given the name null follow-up, I think it's worth mentioning regardless, because with the recent additions that were made to Fae, it's not as clear-cut as other negations or disruptors that we're pretty much familiar with. Null follow-up became extremely widespread over the course of the past year and a half and ultimately made it so everyone could access it, but with the opportunity cost of stats or other effects that could be ran instead. But then enters tier 4 guidance skills, where they actively provide the more desired half of null follow-up to any subsequent ally within its range, aka the offensive half of null follow-up, because you want to secure your doubles as much as possible, which more so ties into the idea of role compression, where you could get more for less, which is a really good idea when you're also considering other effects and skills that don't necessarily get messed up as a result, such as crux skills, because as the dominance of guidance skills pretty much overtook a lot of flyers and we started getting skills that made it so units could get guaranteed follow-up attacks, it made it so null follow-up and guaranteed follow-up can coexist. Although now with the likes of Rift and Potent and Frozen and all sorts of other effects that kind of just do its own thing, it's entirely possible it completely circumvents the system of guaranteed follow-ups, follow-up denial, and null follow-up that we've been accustomed to, in the same way that %DR was once very useful and was the most notable means of tanking hits, barring hardy fighter armors. Usually these types of upgrades are not only really strong, but it also acts as an additive instead of taking away from the game. Even with anti-warp effects that could negate stuff such as guidance, the skill still has use cases in the worst case scenario, such as extra stats and offensive null follow-up, whereas upgrades akin to the likes of firm Canto Curb don't really provide much else beyond the one negation that will inevitably end up as the arena ready option. And I think that's the biggest difference between my perception of what kinds of skills and effects I believe they should add to the game versus what they actually implement into the game. Fae is constantly attempting to innovate and add new things to the game, and considering how many new banners and units we get each month, I'm sure it's fairly tough at some points, but if what they add ends up taking away from the game instead of adding to it, I think that's when it can become an issue. Skills and effects that add to the game open up more opportunities for units to perform and to actively engage in the game, whereas skills that take away things from the game only add unnecessary limitations that make it even harder for people to engage with. And it could get to a point where interest just simply starts fading because it's not worth all the effort. Of course, it will vary by whichever game mode people decide to play, because some skills and effects that are strong in one mode may not carry over to another, whether it's due to specific restrictions such as BST, them specifically stating they do not work in some game modes, or they're just naturally weaker in another setting. But now with 3 game modes to balance around, it becomes even harder to have those types of effects and restrictions without either making them inefficient or having them run rampant in sheer dominance. And I don't want to conflate strong units with bad game design, because you can have units that provide a solid niche or perform really well without being overbearingly absurd by modern metrics, but lately it feels as if a unit or effect is dominant because of their ability to bypass or shut down so many things in an unhealthy way. And of course, I think counters should exist by some metric, and it will ultimately depend on what the effect is, because I'm not going to have any sympathy for stuff such as end turn effects. That was probably just one of the worst things they've ever added to the game. But I think if it comes around to just negating or adding some sort of counterplay to something, then it should probably be done in a way that doesn't outright completely remove it. And while this year really makes 2021 Fae pale in comparison, you know, the year of Bride Catria, Legendary Sigurd, Yuri, Fallen Edelgard, Hardy Fighter, and so on and so forth, I would at least like to mention that a fair bit of units amongst the group of stupidly strong dominant units of this year were nice additives to the game, including the likes of Desert Igren, who gave more ways for infantry to compete in some fashion, at least before Emblem Celica sealed the deal on that front. Although on that note, it's part of the reason why I actively enjoy the emblem effects they started implementing this year. Each emblem effect, regardless of how impactful they were, actively added something to the game that opened up more opportunities for units to find niches or potentially fix fatal flaws with characters that now make them usable. I don't think there's been an emblem effect that actively made a group of characters or skills worthless because they don't take anything away from the game that skills such as Breath of Life or End Turn Smoke do, and because of that, they feel like natural additions to the game. If anything, the 3 we got so far alone probably aided so many more units than anything in the past of who knows how long ago. I can't say that this will remain the case, of course, but 3 for 3 so far is fairly solid, and really at the end of the day, it just becomes a matter of checks and balances with what they're trying to implement and whether or not that's actually really good for the game. Although with how the game is, at this point I don't think there could be any semblance of either, and for as long as the game has been around, there's always been something that dominated the game in some capacity. Units and skills will come and go, and it's not realistic to expect any unit to last forever, even if some do last a good while or can still function decently with old weapons, for example, despite being power crept. But if the worst case scenario for any unit is that they have to be as generic or homogenized as everybody else, then having more to work with will generally be a good thing at the end of the day. Although maybe the solution is to just add so many more broken or insane effects and skills into the game that it ends up becoming more balanced because of how broken everything is. But maybe that would just make everything worse. Hard to say, really.